Welcome to As the Story Grows. I'm Brian Patton. How about something a little different today? Today we welcome author John Wray to the podcast. John's most recent book, Gone to the Wolves, revolves around the late 80s and early 90s death, glam, and black metal scenes. John talks about growing up in Buffalo and his metal fandom, the hard journey that led to his first book, and why metal made a good backdrop for his latest novel. I got to read Gone to the Wolves, and I absolutely loved it. It's a great read if you're a metalhead, but also if you like stories about found family and mystery. We've had some comments on recent episodes over on our Discord server. About chapter 392 with Gozu, Ben Pike said, "Holy shit, Gozu is wonderful. It's like Alice in Chains, but stoner metal. Actually, in an alternate reality, when Lane Stanley died, Alice in Chains replaced him with LaJohn Witherspoon from Sevendust, and they began playing sludgy stoner metal." And on chapter 371, Project 86, Joel said, "I've had a variety of interactions with Andrew over the years, and some were odd. Not entirely sure why, but perhaps just awkwardness on both sides. Ha! This interview was a great listen." You can find a link to our Discord server in the show notes. Come join us and talk about music, the podcast, Star Wars, or whatever you want. On the mailing list this week, I shared a bunch of photos from Current's The Death We Seek tour while they were in Baltimore. AsTheStoryGrows.substack.com to read and subscribe or see the link in the show notes. And lastly, over on Patreon this week, I shared the unedited interview with Archspire. Lots of extra content over there. I hope everyone enjoys today's chat with John Wray. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Now that I've found a place where the internet works and we can actually have a conversation and exchange of ideas, I'm feeling good.
How is the book's been out?
A couple weeks.
A few weeks out? Yeah. How's the reception been so far?
I mean, so far, the reception has been amazing. It's been really excellent. It seems as though, book reviewers and critics are liking it, but also the response from readers has been really great. And that's, that's a little bit more important, especially with a book like this.
Yeah. Yeah. Wikipedia says you were born in Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
That is correct. Wikipedia sometimes gets creative with what it says about me and about everybody.
Yeah.
But that is true. I was born in Washington, D.C., but I spent almost no time there. I spent basically all of my childhood in rusty and dingy and overcast Buffalo, New York. What's funny is that Buffalo actually gets a lot of snow because it's a little warmer.
Oh, yeah?
So, the lake stays unfrozen for longer, than it does in a place like Chicago. So that, that's what lake effect snow is. It's like the open water that's slowly evaporating, turning into mist, and then it turns into snow and dumps down on us again.
Nice. What was growing up like?
I think it was a great place to be a little kid because, people still played, kids played in the streets and you could run around, do whatever you wanted. It was considered to be a fairly safe city. But then as a teenager, I don't know. I had some rough years there as a teenager, which is part of why music became so important to me, and finding a community in the music scene, sort of like the extreme music scene, heavy music scene, was a big deal for me, and really came along at an important moment in my adolescence. Sort of the way that it does for the three characters in Gone to the Wolves.
Yeah. So you were into metal and hardcore, whatever.
Yeah, I was initially more of a punk kid.
Okay.
And then I think through Black Flag, I got more into metal because sort of late era Black Flag, they were getting really into metal and kind of
Yeah.
moving in a more metal direction. And I remember being at a Black Flag show, probably on like their last ever tour. And they've sounded like a metal band, and there were a lot of metalheads in the audience. And that sort of opened up a whole new possible community for me and a whole new kind of direction as a fan of heavy music. And it was amazing because I just sort of felt like my options sort of doubled overnight, you know?
Yeah.
As soon as I welcomed in the possibility of metal, you know, and wasn't just exclusively focused on hardcore, obviously it was like a whole new color palette opened up and all sorts of room for like, you know, to let my imagination run wild. And it just seemed like a much richer sort of, I don't know, musical landscape, I guess you could say. And ever since then, I sort of felt like I had my feet in both worlds. And as they came more and more together, you know, through thrash and other band and crossover, all that stuff, you know, it was really cool to watch these two worlds sort of become integrated into one.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there any point there where you were like, I'm going to pick up an instrument and play in bands locally, or were you just like a fan of the music and that's where you kept yourself?
I started out really just as a fan for quite a few years, which is really the time and the experiences that I drew on for writing Gone to the Wolves, because the main characters in my novel are not rock stars. They're not even in bands. Yeah. They're the true believers, you know, they're like the faithful, and kind of like super fans. And that's what I remembered feeling most, you know, when I was in high school. I did, you know, like a million other kids, start picking up instruments and trying to mess around and, you know, learn how to play the drums and stuff. And I ended up playing in lots and lots of bands that weren't really very good. There's actually an essay that I wrote for Esquire magazine that came out a couple weeks ago about one of those bands that I was in, that was just so bad that at the end of a year of playing together, the two other kids in the band and I, not only did we break up, but we destroyed every tape, every recording that we'd made of practice, everything. We just erased all evidence. And I think, you know, the world is better off for that decision, to be honest. But of course, it was just super important to me. And just like it's, you know, just like music is super, super important for the characters in this novel. You know, there is a time in a lot of people's lives, usually when they're in that kind of teenage kind of rut that seems inescapable, when music is just a total lifesaver. And that's really what my book is about.
Yeah. Yeah. Did Buffalo have a good local scene at the time? I know like Snapcase came up through that scene.
It was a scene, a very small scene of people who were trying very hard and were really, really committed to what they were doing. The biggest band to come out of that time is Cannibal Corpse.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize necessarily that they began in Buffalo. You know, death metal is something that's pretty much almost exclusively associated with like backwoods Florida, sort of swamp country, you know, the Gulf Coast of Florida. But yeah, I mean, of all those bands, I would say, interesting enough, the kind of most extreme and least commercial seeming of them all ended up doing the best commercially, you know? I mean, it's always astonishing to me, you know, Cannibal Corpse, they've sold almost 1 million records. It's incredible. Yeah. That's certainly not something that any of us expected in Buffalo back in the day when they were coming up. I mean, most people would just, you know, run away from their shows. They were famous for starting shows that were full, and then by the end of their set, there'd be like 12 really, really, really delighted kids kind of banging their heads, and, you know, the rest of the venue would just be completely empty.
Yeah.
And then they went on to conquer the world in their way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wild that they exploded the way they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. That any of the music like exploded, it has lasted and like still finds new fans is incredible.
Yeah, that any of that heavy music did as well as it did. It's sort of a mystery to me even to this day. And I'm a big fan of a lot of death metal. Obviously, I mean, I name check Cannibal Corpse in the first sentence of my novel.
Yeah.
But I'm a big fan of Obituary and Morbid Angel and a lot of those bands that came out of Florida. But even I don't understand how there could have been a moment at the end of the 80s when this very regional kind of music and very extreme and uncompromising music became a global phenomenon, with gold records being put out and people moving from all over the world, from Denmark, from Japan, to live in Tampa just so they could record at the same studios that these bands were recording. It's completely incredible to me even now, but very cool.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were in high school, were you also drawn to writing?
I was, I think I wrote my first little attempt at a short story when I was in about 7th or 8th grade. I remember it was like a little science fiction story about a space station and like an asteroid hits a space station and stuff. It wasn't very good, and I didn't think at the time, oh my God, this is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. This is destiny. I didn't have any feelings of that kind at all. In fact, I was probably more interested in, animation. And like, I remember experimenting with claymation and stop motion animation in my basement. I thought that was the greatest thing ever. Writing was just another thing I was kind of messing around with. And that's really how it stayed until I was in my early 20s, I would say, or maybe even my mid 20s. There were so many other creative things that I was kind of experimenting with and interested in. And it was only as I gradually realized that I kind of sucked at all those other things that I found myself thinking, well, it seems as though writing is the one thing that I've tried that people haven't told me to just quit immediately,
Yeah.
Maybe I should explore that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. What did you go to school for?
Well, I was one of those kids who changed their major every semester pretty much.
All right. Yeah.
I mean, I went through, when I first got to college, I thought I was going to be a biologist. I studied biology for a little while. Then I switched to anthropology, and then I switched to studio art, and then I switched to history, and then I switched to God, I don't even know what. But then I ended up being an English major at the very end, but only because when they totaled up all my classes, that was the only thing I had taken enough hours of, So by default, my last year of college, right before I graduated, basically, I was kind of told that I was an English major, And I thought that was fine because it seemed like such a wide open, it was almost like having no major at all, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I was fine with that.
Yeah. Yeah. When you started writing, were you always looking at writing books or novels, or did you try to break in doing like magazines or newspaper journalism?
I've done a lot of journalism, but I kind of fell backwards into it, you could almost say. I was never particularly interested in journalism or doing that kind of writing when I was younger. I did try all sorts of different kinds of, I guess, what you'd call creative writing. I tried to write really, really short things that were almost like poems. And then I tried to write longer things, but being, 19, 20 years old, I didn't really have the patience for that. So, I kind of flailed around all over the place. And it was only actually after my first or even my second novel had been published that I found myself wanting to write about a couple of really specific things that, some music that I was interested in and that kind of stuff. And I found that that there was a place for me as a journalist at certain like sort of big magazines that were looking for non-journalists to do some writing for them, like, oh,
Yeah.
let's get a novelist in, that might be a little bit interesting, a slightly different voice or whatever, even though in the end they just wanted something that sounded exactly like everything else in the magazine.
Yeah.
But so I think my first journalistic article was written when I was in my early 30s, and it was for the New York Times Magazine. So it was kind of like accidentally starting at the top. And I had some friends who were journalists who were kind of like, what the fuck, why are you doing that? I should be doing that, But it was exactly because I hadn't taken that route, because I hadn't gone to journalism school and hadn't been through all of those steps, that somehow I seemed, I don't know, like a curiosity or something to, something a little bit off the beaten path to these magazine editors. And I think it actually ended up being a strength not to have studied journalism, which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
Yeah. What led to the writing and the publishing of your first novel, The Right Hand of Sleep?
Well, what led to it was like a bunch of years of just slogging away at something that seemed like a good idea, without any real sense of whether it made sense to do or not. I was living believe it or not, I was living in a tent at the time, in New York City, but in a tent. I was living in. I'd been laid off from a job I'd had at an art gallery, and had been kicked out of this sublet that I had, which was a terrible place to live anyway. But I had some friends who were in a band, and they had a rehearsal space in the basement of this sort of semi-abandoned warehouse on the Brooklyn side, under the Brooklyn Bridge. And they just kind of let me crash there for what was going to be a month, and then turned into 2 months, and then turned into 3 months. But I really just had one of those little dome tents, and I pitched it in the back room of their practice space. And then I just became the weird troll under the bridge, like the weird guy who lived in the practice space. And bands would come and go, and they'd be like, "Oh, hey, John, what's up?" I'm sure they thought, like, who is this freak? But I had a rent-free living situation then, which is what really allowed me to have the time and sort of mental space to try and write a book. And that was really the first time that I wrote something that was really a book, in terms of its length, and something that worked, that you could read from start to finish. And I ended up living in that tent for 1.5 years.
Wow.
Yeah. And there were rats down there, and there were no windows down there. There was no shower. I had to shower at friends' houses. It was really, I had to go to the public library nearby to wash my feet every day. It was like that. Everyone assumed I was just a junkie or strung out or, semi-homeless, which I guess technically is true. But that was the perfect combination for me of a lot of free time, but also quite a lot of pressure, because there was, everyone was like, "What are you doing down there? Like, do we have to worry about you? Do we have to do an intervention with you?" So I had some motivation to show people that I wasn't just, crying for help silently by living in this basement. I had my tent quite comfortably arranged. It was actually not a bad way to be for a while, although I became more and more of a vampire. There were no windows, so I would just start sleeping later and later and later. And after about 6 months, I was up all night and sleeping all day long. Very strange way to live. But, fortunately, I did eventually publish that book. And ever since then, I've had a pretty normal day-to-day life, I would say.
Yeah, you really embodied the starving artist trope there.
Yeah, and I to the point that it was like a ridiculous cliche almost, and friends were like, "Come on, what are you trying to prove here?"
Yeah. What inspires each of your books? You have like a real eclectic set of novels. Like every book deals with some different time in history or set. I mean, there seems to be some underpinning of like a love of history and incorporating history in your novels. But how do you like go about choosing a subject to write when you start?
You know, it's funny. It is kind of a motley mix of different topics. If you look back over the, God, I guess six books that I've written, but it's almost motivated. Each new project that I choose is almost motivated less by a kind of idea of where do I want to go from here, and more just sort of a feeling of, oh God, I've spent the last 3, 4, 5 years on this book, and I've just finished that book. Thank God. I thought I would never finish it. It was so fucking hard. I want to do something as different as possible. Whatever I do next, it can't have anything to do with the book that I just finished, just because, you spend years and years and years on something. If you're really giving it everything you've got, you're going to be pretty burnt out on that topic by the time you're done. I don't really understand how writers do it who have like a very specific kind of territory that they've staked out, that they kind of revisit over and over again, Obviously, it works for a lot of writers, and it probably makes good sort of commercial sense, so that you build up a readership and they know what to expect from you more or less. But I've just never been able to do that, to be honest. I just have to try something. I have to do something very, very different from the last thing so that it seems new and fresh and exciting, and so that I can get motivated, because it is a lot of work.
Well, the most recent one, Gone to the Wolves. What led you to finally write about death metal and metal in general?
It's funny, even though I have some of that in my background, I didn't set out to write a book about metal at all. The very beginnings of this novel had more to do with the place that it begins. I had some friends, got to know some people from some very specific parts of Central and Gulf Coast Florida. And one of them in particular, he had so many great stories about what it was like to grow up there. And they were so strange and so intense and so hilarious in their way. I remember one day we were just hanging out, and he just, making conversation maybe at a bar somewhere. And he started telling me about this neighbor of his who had been like a complete, 9-to-5 office guy, good kind of soldier in the workforce, who one day in the middle of a particularly steaming hot Florida summer woke up in the morning, and instead of going to work, he just went to the hardware store and bought a shovel, went back to his house, went out into the fenced-in backyard that he had, and just started digging, and just kept digging and digging and digging until he'd made a hole that was as wide and as deep as he possibly could make it, given the fact that he was working in like a fenced-in backyard. And then he put the shovel down, went out in front of his house, and tried to start charging people admission to see the hole. Yeah.
Wow.
So when I heard that story, I thought, oh my God, I mean, that has to be somewhere in some kind of book that somebody writes. And it just, these amazing stories and descriptions kind of started accumulating. So then I remember thinking, well, I should do something. I should, why not try to write a story that's set in this world? And then it was a question of, well, when should the story take place? I kind of started to think about some characters. Then for whatever reason, I decided to give the main character, the protagonist, my exact birth date and birth year, so we were exactly the same age. And then I thought, okay, well, what was happening around this time when this kid Kip would be kind of in his late teens? And that's when I realized there was this kind of very lucky connection, like a coincidence, which really was that right at that time, exactly this part of Florida was in the middle of this kind of incredible kind of creative ferment, and there are all these amazing bands creating the genre of music that would be known as death metal. It really just happened to be happening there at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I'd never really thought about writing about the music I was into when I was a teenager in any direct way. I never thought of that as, necessarily something to base a book around. But when I realized that there was this incredible coincidence, I suddenly started thinking about it more. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized what an incredibly rich and kind of fertile subject matter the culture of metalheads in the U.S., particularly in the 80s and 90s, to me, just how, like really it was kind of like a world that was dying to be written about, begging to be written about in fiction. I had never come across a novel that really addressed that or investigated that whole culture. Mm-hmm. And from that point on, I really knew that I had a good idea, and I just kind of went for it, And then years and years went by, and now the book is out there in the world, which is pretty fun.
Yeah. Yeah. When you're researching, are you just spending time online reading articles or other books, or did you travel to these places in Florida, LA, and Norway?
Both, I would say.
Yeah.
I always feel as though people think that I do a lot of research. I think they think I do a lot more research than I actually do. I always say you should do exactly as much research as you need to get to the point in your own head when you feel comfortable making things up.
Yeah.
When you sort of feel comfortable bullshitting and kind of like making up tall tales and kind of inventing things, when you feel confident enough that you have a grounding in a place and a time and a culture or whatever it is, that's when you've done enough research, and then you can start. And then, you may have to stop and think and, like say, oh, okay, I'm writing about this. And, like what happened in November of 1993. And then you might have to stop and do a little bit of research. Or maybe you're writing a scene where two characters sit down in Norway and they order a meal, and you realize you don't know exactly what that meal would be, So at that point, you can kind of do these sort of triage, you just kind of, what you need, rather than just trying to learn everything about a subject, like, I don't know what, the Second World War or something.
Yeah.
That's a lot of information. You could spend years trying to learn all that. I think it's much better to get a basic foundation in, let's say, the Second World War, and then start writing it. And, okay, you might realize that you're going to have to write about the Battle of Okinawa. Then you read about Okinawa. You don't read about the entire decade in which the world was at war with itself. It's just, that would just slow everything down so much. I always say you as the author, you control where the camera is pointing. It's not like a panoramic camera. You don't know, it's sort of like when John Ford was making, Western films, he could shoot a scene in which it appeared like there were 1,000 soldiers fighting. And in fact, he only had about 50 guys, but they were just kind of running around behind the camera and running in front of the camera again, But to the person sitting in the theater, that's thousands of cowboys and Indians and Civil War soldiers running around. As a writer and as a director, of course, you control where the camera's pointing. So you know exactly what kind of research you need because you know what scenes you want to write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Your book touches on things like racism and homophobia, and without being heavy-handed about it, is it tough to write about those things and just be like, this is what was happening at the time and it was fucked up, without like being political or social commentary?
Yeah, I think that's something that you learn as you go. There's a place for political commentary, social commentary, and opinions of that kind, but I don't know that it is in fiction. You know, it's kind of like if you're writing a story or a novel and you start to get the feeling that you're actually writing an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, you're probably doing something wrong. You should probably stop and think about why you might want to be lecturing your readers. You know, it's just usually not a successful. How should I put this? That's usually not the way to keep your readers engaged. You know, you never want to sort of show your hand in that way, and you never want the reader to feel as though they're being spoon-fed opinions and ideas about things. You know, I mean, people get irritated if they feel that they're being underestimated. You know, you kind of want to get your point across, but you don't want to be steering the reader or have anyone feel that they're being told what to think. You know, that's why it's usually better just to present a situation and never overtly give opinions about this or that. You know, your characters can have strong opinions, but even then the characters shouldn't be giving exactly your opinion, you know, because you need to have disagreement among your characters, and it's not good to have one character who's always right and one character who's always wrong. I mean, that's instantly boring.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you have to kind of break yourself up into little bits. And in the same way that we all have kind of debates with ourselves a lot of the time when we're walking down the street or when we're watching the news on TV, you know, each of those little voices that are kind of, you know, presenting different points of view, even in your own head, each of those could perhaps become the voice of, you know, the two or three characters who are having a conversation in a given scene in a novel.
Yeah. The first half of this book is really this fucked up found family finding their way through life together, and then you know, that midway point, it really twists and becomes a mystery and a thriller. Did you always know that you were going to go and have this be like this mystery type novel?
No, I think again that's something that sort of developed in an organic way as I was working on it. I think around the time that I realized that at least I personally didn't know of any novels about metal or about this kind of heavy music kind of culture that I was trying to write about. I started to think that the book I was writing had to in some way be kind of representative of all the different kind of subgenres and all the sort of variety that metal contains. You know, I mean, anyone who listens to metal knows that there's not just one kind of metal. There's not one kind of person who listens to metal. You know, fans of that kind of music have a wide variety of points of view, you know, can have very different tastes. So then I kind of realized that I was going to have different sections of the book that were going to be based in like a different musical genre in each case. I think that once I made the decision that the novel would be divided into three sections, following the lives of these three characters who are, you know, really big metal fans, from one metal scene and one region to another. You know, the book starts in Florida, as we said, and then these three kids who just, you know, meet at a metal show, move together to Los Angeles and, you know, try to be kind of grown-ups there and find jobs. And that's a period in the book when sort of glam metal and thrash are setting the tone. And then the final third of the book is set in Norway during the rise of what came to be known as Norwegian black metal. I think as soon as I knew that the book was going to kind of conclude in that part of the world, in Norway in the winter, and have that type of metal as its I guess you could say its score or its soundtrack.
Mm-hmm.
I think I just felt like the genre of fiction that best sort of suited the music was something along the lines of a thriller or something really suspenseful and dark.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just noticing, looking at the cover for the book, that it's like the three different genres of metal in the logos, the Gone, and then the two as the hair metal, and Wolves is your like more extreme black metal. Was that intentional?
Yeah. That was very much intentional. I'm glad that you noticed that.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it, I'm like, oh, I get it now.
Yeah. And within the book, you have those title pages when, the first section is called Venice Death, the second section is called LA Glam, and the third section is called Bergen Black, because, giving the reader the location, and then also the kind of metal that is sort of going to be setting the tone. And each of those pages are in a different type of lettering too. I have to say my publisher did a really amazing job with the visual design of the book.
Yeah. It's really cool. I like the book is like, outside of just like the connection to metal and music, it's like this friendship based on metal, and then kind of as people's interest in the music or the scenes change, the way that changes the friendship, and how like realistic that is to people whose friendship is built on something like metal. I've seen that in my own life, so is very relatable.
I'm good. I'm glad you say that. Yeah. I mean, to me, the novel is as much a portrait of a very specific friendship, kind of like a three-way triangular friendship between the three main characters, and how that friendship evolves over about 10 years, starting when they're teenagers and ending in their mid-20s roughly, as it is about metal or about LA or Florida or Norway. The friendship had to be at the core of it, and the characters had to be at the very core of the novel, because that's really what keeps a person reading a novel all the way through, is to find out what happens to these people that we get to know pretty well and hopefully care about.
Yeah. The relationships, definitely you find yourself caring for Leslie and what happens to him, and Kip and Kira, and like their dynamic, and like, no matter how fucked up it is, you're rooting for them.
I hope so. They're complicated characters who are basically decent people, but of course they fuck up, and of course they make questionable choices that can be very, irritating to kind of, even for their friends. These are very fallible human beings who make a lot of mistakes, but that's kind of what the stuff of the plot of a novel is made of. If no one ever made any terrible mistakes, there would probably be no novels and maybe no stories.
Yeah. Is the book and publishing industry similar to the music industry, where this book has been done for like a year or two or three, and it's just been this process of trying to like work through edits and then like publishing and production, and like, I don't know, did COVID mess up like book production in the same way it did vinyl production?
I do think COVID slowed things down and created a bottleneck, as it did for most industries. But even before COVID, there was usually about a year between a book being finished and the book actually being out in bookstores. Wow. It's just, for whatever reason, that's just usually the length of time that it takes. I mean, books, about politics, or nonfiction books, or, biographies of politicians or something that are really, need to be rushed out because there's some very specific target date. Those books, I think, are put into some kind of special expedited pipeline, and they come out, maybe within 6 months or so. But it is a long wait. Yeah.
Well, since this book's probably been done a minute, like, have you been working on something else? Or are you already in the thick of a new project? And it's like, is it nice to revisit this book now that it's out?
I mean, I had more fun writing Gone to the Wolves than any other book I've ever written. There was something about it that was just pure joy for me to do. So yeah, it's great to revisit it and see it out in the world and spend some time with it again. I'm actually not working on anything new at the moment. I'm really in what's for me a very unusual kind of period of sort of just like, I don't know, looking back and trying to be really sure what I want to do next before I jump into it. It's probably directly connected to having a small kid, I mean, I just spend a lot of time taking care of my son and not getting enough sleep and doing the dishes, changing diapers. That is pretty much my job now, and writing is more something like I do on the weekends at this point. Hopefully that'll change within the next year. He's going to start going to school and all that. I'm very hopeful that will change soon.
It gets easier.
Oh, good. That's good to know. Thanks for telling me. I hope so.
And harder, but easier in that regard.
Yeah. I'm sure some other hard stuff will come up and, compensate for the fact that, he can go to the bathroom by himself.
Thanks for listening to As the Story Grows. Our intro music was written and composed by Jeremy Hunt. The As the Story Grows theme is by Bob Nana. If you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and give us a rating and review. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can join us at patreon.com/asthestorygrows. Be a part of our community and join the ongoing conversation over on Discord. If you enjoy this episode, share it on social media with your friends. Much appreciated, and thanks for listening.